amazing memes and videos. I highly suggest this one where someone's jumping into a creek and through an inner tube. It's really, really amazing. But algorithms are making these decisions about what to suggest to us. Someone submits a news link, you click on a headline, you upvote it, you discuss it. There are all sorts of signals that the algorithm pays attention to. Some of them are negative signals. And then there's this news aggregator that pays attention to our behavior. Usually it's some kind of trade secret. And it decides, does it want to promote or does it want to demote that article in the recommendations? Put it higher, put it lower, put it on the list, take it off the list. And then of course, if it makes it onto the list, it then is seen by more people who give it more signals about that particular piece of news. And we know that aggregators can create runaway behavioral patterns and self-fulfilling prophecies. Matt Selganik famously did work that shows that if you reverse the order of music to show the lower quality music on the top and the higher quality music on the bottom, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy where eventually people consider the lower quality music to be more popular. And on top of that, small changes in the ratings can also create these runaway effects. A study by a group of researchers in Science a few years ago showed that on Reddit, simply clicking the upvote button once early in the trajectory of something could create this herding effect where the positive final ratings of a piece of information posted to Reddit could be increased by 25% just through one click. So we have this situation where people are naturally susceptible to misinformation. There are all of these social, cultural, and psychological things going on. And on top of that, we have a range of news aggregation algorithms that are distributing that information further, perhaps. What can we do about that? Well, one option is to increase surveillance and censorship, to monitor everything that gets posted, to have people look at it, to use artificial intelligence systems to decide what's fake or not, and then minimize the visibility of that information. If you're a government, if you're a platform, you have that avenue available to you. Journalists and civil society groups often talk about counter-speech. What are ways that we can organize people to use alternative means to censorship, like fact-checking or critical thinking efforts? We could imagine some kind of hypothetical algorithmic governance, but that's a big question mark for research that I know a lot of people here are still figuring out what that means. And then we can think about behavioral nudges. We've seen platforms do things like label misinformation as disputed, for example, in hopes that it will nudge people in various directions. And all of these interventions assume that we actually have the capacity to deliver reliable effects on people's beliefs and their behavior. Questions that we don't always test rigorously, and which I want to share an example of one test. How does this play out in practice? I've already shown you an example of false claims that were wildly popular that fed fears on the Reddit platform. In my research, I should step back. There are a few things you could do when an article appears on a platform. You could report it to law enforcement, and if you're in a country that has laws against hate speech, you could argue, but probably not very successfully, that something like this that's inaccurate, that is fomenting prejudice, could be classified as hate speech. I don't think this would probably fit that category, even in the EU. You could report it to the platform and ask them to remove the article, which in this case was not done. You could also report it to volunteer moderators. On the Reddit platform, each conversation space is moderated by volunteers who then decide what remains and what disappears from the site. And then, of course, you have the ability to click on these buttons to upvote or downvote an article and ostensibly influence the algorithmic rating and ranking of an article. Over the last about 3 or 4 years, I've been doing extensive ethnographic research with volunteer moderators and community members on the Reddit platform and on Twitter, looking at the kinds of harassment that people face, looking at how they manage policies and govern their communities, and how they make sense of issues from misinformation to welcoming newcomers to managing unacceptable behavior. I won't have much time today to go through those findings, but that's kind of the underlying bedrock of this experimental work that I'll be talking about today. What I do want to note is that volunteer moderators have been a basic part of how the internet works from the very, very earliest conversational systems on the internet. Going back to actually the community memory system in Berkeley in the 1960s and 70s, the well. Today we have Facebook group admins, Reddit moderators, Wikipedia administrators. Xbox even has something called Enforcement United, where volunteer gamers review what happens on the platform and make decisions about what's acceptable. And they do more than just remove things. On a site like Reddit, where you have book clubs, suicide watch conversations, you have places for sharing unexpected and shocking material, places where people can find jobs, discussions of peer-reviewed research, a pretty wide range of conversations. Moderators are the facilitators. They're the people who patch over the cracks of social relations online. They promote communities. They also do this moderation work. And there are a lot of moderators. And when I just looked at the number of formal moderation roles on the Reddit platform in 2015, I found over 148,000 accounts that had a formal moderation role. Now, not all of them are active every day, but to give you a sense of the number of people that take some kind of action to offer peer support or intervene in problematic situations they see online, a recent Data and Society report found that 46% of American internet users report taking some kind of action when they observe a case of online harassment. That's about 100 million people. So when we think about the governance power of governments or platforms, and there are thousands of paid click workers who make decisions, they're dramatically dwarfed by the everyday citizens who at least do occasional work to manage, difficult problems that they face online. People I've talked to in my ethnographic fieldwork, one example is a woman who used to be very involved supporting children through something called the Ronald McDonald House, which offers care and support to children who go through surgical and other medical procedures. She decided to stop volunteering there, to spend several hours a day moderating a large community on Reddit because she felt she could have more of an impact there. So there are a lot of people who care deeply about their online spaces. One community that I was approached about a year ago is the World News discussion group on Reddit. They had about 14 million subscribers at the time, over 70 volunteer moderators, and among the many conversations they hosted, they had 23 discussions about these tabloid articles per day. And the question that they asked me was, can we cause people to question news from inaccurate sources without making the news trend on platform algorithms? Let me explain a little bit more what their concern was. So as news from inaccurate sources comes in, they wanted to suggest fact-checking as an alternative to just automatically remove all articles from these sources. They thought this would be a way to involve their community, support more critical thinking, and also avoid this kind of surveillance censorship approach to managing the problem. And they thought maybe this would, in fact, cause people to fact-check the articles, but it might be possible that the news aggregator would notice that. It would think, oh, there's all of this additional activity around these articles, and consequently promote the article further. That there could be a beneficial behavioral outcome to this nudge, but there could be an algorithmic side effect that could work against the benefits that they were working towards. So I'm trying to think about this idea as an AI nudge, where you have this second-order effect of influencing human behavior on the behavior of some kind of algorithmic system. So here's how we set up a field experiment to test the behavioral outcomes and also look for whether there was this AI nudge on the behavior of Reddit's algorithms. So we observed news links as they came into this community, and then we assigned them to one of three conditions. There's a control group where we didn't do anything, and then a case where we encouraged people to fact check, and then a third case where we thought if we encourage people to fact check and use that voting mechanism, they may be able to mitigate this possible AI nudge from the algorithms. And so here's what we posted to the top of discussions in this community. I'll read a little bit out because I know the screen is not very large. So the key thing is we asked people to improve the thread by linking to media that verifies or questions the article's claims. And in the fact-checking and voting condition, we posted something persistently to the very top, where we also added a sentence. If you can't independently verify these claims, please consider downvoting. And we observed two kinds of things in these discussions. In cases where some discussions randomly received these various conditions, we looked at behavioral outcomes on whether a comment included links. And then we also monitored every, I think it was 4 or 5 minutes, the list of recommendations of news articles that Reddit was suggesting within this community, and gave them a number from 0 to 300. 0 meaning it's not even on the list, 300 meaning it's at the top of the list. And here's what that trajectory looks like, where some articles, they kind of start at a similar place. Some articles have this kind of arc where they're popular, and then over the 7-hour period, they start to become, they move down the ranking, probably due to some kind of decay function in the algorithm. In some cases, often because it's a duplicate article or there's some other policy violation, the moderators will just remove it from their community, where it just goes from whatever number it is to 0. But that's the kind of arc that an article will take over the course of a 7-hour period in the rankings. And we had a few hypotheses. One was that encouraging fact-checking would, in fact, increase people's fact-checking behavior. Then we had two hypotheses about the algorithm itself. One was that we might increase the maximum the maximum position, basically, of that news article in the rankings by encouraging fact-checking. We thought there would be this backfire on the algorithms. And here's the pre-registration plan on the Open Science Framework for that particular, for the whole set of hypotheses. And then we thought that if we encourage people to downvote, we might mitigate that kind of runaway effect on the algorithm. To give you a sense of the kind of conversations that happen, we would post this to the top. I've anonymized the actual conversations, but people would often reply directly to this post. They would say, hey, I found these other sources. They would link to things. And then they would sometimes debate whether they trusted the various additional information that was shared. I should note that there were a number of cases where the original poster of the article linked to further information, sometimes defensively. There were other cases where wider community was posting all sorts of links.
Just a quick clarification. Did you try to prevent one treatment from influencing the other treatment? That is, even for articles where you're not encouraging downloading, because there are other articles where you are encouraging that, people might carry over that behavior.
So we were not, so the question is whether we were able to prevent interference of a particular kind, where if we're encouraging people to downvote or we're encouraging people to fact check, maybe I imagine they would be like, oh, this is a thing that I can do. I'm now going to do this elsewhere. And so there could be spillover between the different conditions in this experiment. In this particular study, we weren't able to observe individual behavior because we weren't operating internally on the Reddit platform. And that would be necessary for us to be able to kind of observe or monitor that particular kind of spillover. Though I suppose we could go back and look to see for individuals, actually it would be a good follow-up analysis, to see for individuals who did kind of provide a fact check in one kind of condition, do they carry on that behavior elsewhere? It would be a really fun follow-up analysis that we might be able to get the right kind of exogeneity from this treatment to ask that question. Actually, I'm going to go back and look at that. That's a great question, Arvind. So, here just looking at the balance of the the experiment, we could only hear, because we're treating discussions, we can only look at articles with comments, and there's pretty decent balance there. And there are some other summary statistics which you want to follow up with, we can talk about. But in terms of the first hypothesis, adjusting for multiple comparisons and doing things like adjusting standard errors for the flat factor that's a cluster design, we do find that encouraging fact-checking does increase the chance that a comment will include links. A comment in the discussion will include links on average. It doesn't look like a lot, but it's still a substantial increase in people's conversation about these issues. And I also did a follow-up analysis to look at the chance of a discussion to include a kind of link-bearing comment. And that went up substantially and significantly as well. But in terms of these other hypotheses, in the initial model that I specified, I actually failed to observe a statistically significant effect from either intervention on the maximum rank position achieved by an article. And there are a few reasons that this might be. One could be there's just no discernible effect, our sample was too small, or something else. But also the rank position of an article at a given time is relative to other articles. So, and it's related to maybe the pool of votes and activity at that particular moment in time. So you could imagine that an article that is in the top position on Thursday at 2 p.m. might have different levels of activity around it than an article that's on the top position on Saturday at midnight. And so just looking at the maximum rank position achieved by an article doesn't allow us to account for the kind of relative ranking of articles, especially when multiple treated articles would appear in the same rankings. And then also there's this interference from other treatments. So we did a follow-up analysis to try to get a better estimate on that. And to do that, what I did was I took these time slices where we observed what was on the rankings and then collapsed it to a data frame where we basically have the first time slice, the second time slice, the third time slice for each article, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, 12 minutes. And then estimated the average treatment effect for an article at 4 minutes, at 8 minutes, 12 minutes, and so forth. And that allowed me to specify a model that would account for these other factors, right? So, we're predicting the article rank position at time t. We include the treatment effect, whether the article was permitted by moderators at that time or whether it was bumped to the bottom, and then a few other factors. The median score of the other ranked articles at time t. So Reddit gives this obfuscated number that they say is somewhat connected to user activity, and which I was able to show is correlated, at least, to the rank position of articles. And so by listing the median score of other ranked articles at time t, it accounts for the fact that, or for the kind of relative positioning of articles, and then also controlling for overspill, the other number of other treated articles in the top and at time p. So to get a more precise estimate, not just in the maximum rank position of an article, but at the effect on an article at a position in time t. And so here, for example, is a chart that just shows each of those regression models with their estimated rank position, linear regression, and their confidence intervals at a given time. And it kind of surprised us because we thought that encouraging fact-checking would have the opposite effect. We thought the curve would be something like this, because we thought that this perhaps increased activity would cause the algorithm to promote something more. And in fact, what I saw was that encouraging fact-checking actually reduced the rank position of an article from a routinely inaccurate source by as many as around 24 rank positions over time. And you can expect that effect to change as more news articles become available and the article gets older. And I was really surprised by this finding, that here's the same model for the second treatment, where we encourage people to both fact check and vote. And there might be some small effect, but if so, we didn't, we weren't able to determine that through our statistical models. So, encouraging fact checking does reduce the spread of inaccurate news by Reddit's algorithm, but only if you don't ask people to influence the algorithm. That was really surprising because, of course, those buttons are there to influence the algorithm. That's why they've been put in place. And then I also did some work to kind of characterize the overall shape of that effect with a cubic polynomial model. To kind of sum up what the world news community and I learned from this, yes, encouraging fact checking does increase people's fact checking behavior, but we're completely wrong about the effect on the algorithm. Jason?
Yeah, that's a really interesting finding, the fact that it decreased the article rank. And I was wondering if you had explored some mechanisms by which that might happen. So, for example, just taking threads in which there are a lot of links posted after an article is posted and seeing if that ranking decreased after the links were posted as well.
Yeah, so the question is, are there ways to dive further into the data, particularly the comment data, to see if there are heterogeneous treatment effects or things that correlate to the effect that might help better explain the mechanisms? Also, follow-up studies that I think are worthwhile. I do have a few theories. So one is that, I initially thought that encouraging fact-checking would increase the number of comments on an article. But that's not true. The control group, the mean number of comments was 60.6 comments, fact-checking 12.4, and fact-checking plus voting 22.4. Talking to the moderators and doing some more qualitative work, this may be because when the community really dislikes articles from these news sources. And that made it easier for us to come up with a list of publishers. And so when articles are posted to the community from these sources, there are a lot of complaints and a lot of discussions of whether they should be banned or not. And by encouraging people to fact check, moderators believe that we channeled people's energy in a much more constructive direction. And there was also a clear indication that the moderators were doing something. And so it reduced the complaining. And that's their explanation for why there might be a reduction in comments. That may be one of the reasons why encouraging fact-checking actually had the opposite effect from what we expected. So it could be, go ahead, Art.
I was just wondering if you have a control for article rank on that table, because in the control condition, the article ranks are better until better ranked articles will have more comments.
That's a really good point. So Arvind pointed out that the articles that were in the control condition would have been ranked more highly and consequently may have received more comments. So that could be a confounding factor to this explanation. And it may be possible to go back and do analysis of that. That's a really good point. Thanks, Arvind.
As long as we're throwing out theories right now, you didn't do only voting. I'm wondering if maybe this wouldn't last for a long time, but online communities hate being told what to do.
Yep.
And so whether it was actually an active rebellion and supporting of the things because they didn't like you saying to downvote them.
Absolutely. So there's a kind of a thing, well-documented thing in psychology called reactance. You tell people to do something from authority, like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to upvote it. So that's possible. It's also possible that the submitters might have mobilized their friends or their other accounts when we revealed to them by encouraging downvoting that we were trying to influence the algorithm. That may have given them a reason then to mobilize in some way. And then it's also possible that encouraging two tasks rather than one may have influenced the timing of people's comments and votes. You recall that study by Muchnick and Taylor and others that found that an early upvote has a massive effect on the number of votes that something receives in the future. And so it's likely that if our intervention caused people to delay their voting by first fact-checking and then voting on the article as we asked, that could have reduced the impact of individual votes on the algorithm. None of these are things that we can easily test, but they're possible explanations for the effect that the community and I observe.
This may be an obvious question, but are the comments themselves, the text of the comments, the signal into the algorithm for where it's ranked itself?
So the question is whether the text of the comments are a signal to the algorithm. There's a very old version of this algorithm which has been replaced. That is in the open source code of Reddit. So this is more of a black box algorithm situation. And I had some emails with the team at Reddit just to make sure the assumptions of my models weren't incompatible with how their system worked. And they were very kind to confirm that. But because this is, of course, is an algorithm that people are constantly trying to game, I was not able to obtain like the details of exactly what this system looks at. So as we think about what we can do about misinformation, what we can do about like governing human behavior online, yes, we need to continue asking these questions about individuals, psychology, perception. We need to continue asking these questions about context, culture, and structure. But there's a new class of questions around how those things interact with the behavior of intelligent machines of various kinds that are constantly reacting and adjusting what they do based on what they observe. So that's an example of the kind of experiment that I've been doing over the last couple of years. And I want to take a step back and ask what that means for society. Studies like this one may offer powerful guidance for communities who are trying to govern online behavior. But because this governance is powerful, we need to ask questions about how to govern wisely and who should be responsible. I think our study was beneficial. That's not always true of online behavioral research. This April, a New York Times Magazine article accused the ride-hailing company Uber of pulling its workers' psychological levers. They'd hired hundreds of social scientists and generated all sorts of evidence, and according to the article, used that to influence drivers against their own self-interest to benefit the company. Those experiments are not that different in character to the one I've just shared with you, and they're incredibly common. I know this is something that folks here have thought a lot about. I've been really inspired by Dylan Reisman's work, looking at the scale of A/B testing on the web. Here's a chart by Ron Kohavi that goes up to 2013, where he claimed that Bing was doing 300 behavioral experiments a day at that point and continuing to scale. The latest paper by the Bing team reports the last 21,000 behavioral experiments they've done in the last 2 years, to the point where they can support an engineer with very little social science knowledge to develop a behavioral study and test a product idea and make a decision as a company within a week to a week and a half, often with millions of participants. When thinking about this kind of state of affairs, Rosenblatt and Stark have called it a kind of information and power asymmetry, the kind of power that allowed Uber to use experimentation to allegedly exploit workers. They have the power to govern, control over the tech, control over data, the power to experiment. They do it in secrecy. And the Uber drivers basically have a forum where they can complain about it. And that's the kind of natural state of affairs for all of us on the internet, where platforms have this capacity, and we have very little on this side. Now, one avenue to take that I know a lot of people here is to try to improve the ethics and accountability of work on this side. But there's also a need to resolve the power and information asymmetry by finding new ways to expand citizen power, the power and information of the public. And this covers a wide range of issues, particularly as platforms are more and more involved in socio-technical interventions with profound impacts on human flourishing. We heard last week here at CITP from Adam Miner on platform interventions to use AI in suicide prevention. We still have no clinical trials on whether they cost lives or save lives. We've seen in the last year that social platforms are using AI in hopes of detecting terrorist content and managing extremism. But again, we have very little evidence on whether that's making a difference. There was just a story this week about Facebook's machine translation mistranslating good morning in Arabic into a message about harm, and this Palestinian construction worker was arrested by Israeli police under suspicion of terrorism because of a mistranslation of a Facebook message. And so there are substantial risks at the high end that we need to find ways to manage and govern without reinforcing that information and power asymmetry. So there are a few inspirations that I draw from in my work. One is Kurt Lewin, who I can talk lots about after or further. He was one of the founders of social psychology, one of the founders of organizational behavior, one of the earliest people to do behavioral experiments in an industrial context. And he was worried about what he called autocratic management and where this would lead. At the same time, he wanted the tools of psychology and behavioral research to be put to the disposal of democracies. And so he advocated for this idea of action research, where democratic communities would have access to the tools of experimentation to set the agenda and ask questions that mattered to them. Similarly, Donald Campbell, who wrote the first textbook on behavioral experiments in the social sciences, who's seen as the founder of evidence-based policy in the social sciences, argued that if taken to its limits, this approach would actually move towards a closed society and not an open one that was more authoritarian and less democratic. And he argued for an idea of community-led experiments where everyday citizens could have a role to set the agenda of studies, share evidence, and fill in that other half of the information and power asymmetry. Now, for Lewin and Campbell, it was before the personal computer, the idea that anyone might have access to the ability to process data was still long into the future. So these were imagined as kind of utopian ideas. I'm going to skip over the Ostrom slide, which is too bad, because I love Ostrom. But I want to point out that in other industries that have become integrated into a basic part of society, we've also evolved public interest research ecosystems. So with consumer products, we have organizations like UL and others that make sure our electronics don't blow up in our face. In the world of health, organizations like The Lancet were founded in the 1840s to provide the public with information about the health of food and drugs, and have led to our current medical regulatory regime and the public interest research that is part of that. We have a long history of citizen science, government, scientific research, and public interest environmental research. But we don't really have any of those things for social technology. We have a few academics who do research at a valuable but still snail's pace, many of them here in this room. But in order to manage the risks and realize the benefits of a society where there is this experimentation power, where we do have these unanticipated outcomes from human and algorithmic behavior, we need to find a way to fill this question mark. And that's what I'm trying to do, partly during my time here at CITP, through the idea of citizen behavioral science. So the CivilServant project is my dissertation project. It's software and it's an organization that does two things. It supports citizen behavioral science studies of the kind that I just shared, which was done completely independently of the Reddit platform, done together with the moderators and community. And we also do independent evaluation of the social impact of platform technologies. The software supports communities to co-design experiments, coordinate the intervention, like you saw, estimate the results of the study, and then we support remixes and replications. There's this idea from Campbell of like contagious cross-validation, where if you have lots of communities that are able to do experimentation, as they share ideas between them, they can replicate each other's studies, and we're starting to do that with CivilServant. The software, plugs into a platform's API. We collect data with the consent of the community. We coordinate the intervention, and then manage the research ethics, which I can talk about more if people are curious. And then as communities do more and more studies, we contribute to an open archive of experiment results. I'm going to skip forward to a few things about where we're at and questions that I have. So we've done this study, we've done research on preventing harassment, just finished the interventions on a conflict management study in a 3 million person politics discussion group. We're going to be doing research on different ways to ban accounts, and I'm happy to say that we have some funding and are starting to hire to expand to other platforms. CivilServant is being incubated by the citizen media organization Global Voices, which is already working in 167 countries and 40 languages, which should allow us to do international work very quickly. And it has support from the Ethics and Governance of Artificial Intelligence Fund, the Kahneman Treisman Center here at Princeton, and of course, as a postdoc here, CITP is also supporting this work. I'll just mention a study that is coming up that I'm doing with a number of people here on Princeton. This is a study where we're looking at both the chilling effect, and also doing it with Jonathan Penny and Mary Moo. So we're looking at the chilling effect of automated copyright takedowns. I don't have too much time to talk about how that works, but basically when you post things to Twitter, machine learning systems monitor what you say and send you nasty legal letters and try to get Twitter to take down what you've posted if they think you've posted something that violates copyright. And we think that it likely has not only an effect on the world of copyright, but also on people's exercise of their speech rights. And in fact, Mary Moo did an initial analysis that looked at the number of tweets per day of people who receive these takedown notices in the period before they get the notice and then in the period after. And we see a change not only in the mean number of tweets, but also in the rate at which they're tweeting over time. So they go from an increase to a decrease in tweets over that period. And we're doing a study where we're not only trying to estimate that chilling effect, but we're trying to untangle whether that comes from concerns about law enforcement, whether that comes from concerns about surveillance, and whether we can create an automated system that actually mitigates those chilling effects. And that will be its own experiment that will be starting sometime this fall. And we hope that it'll have benefits to the public, contributions to empirical legal studies around how should we manage copyright, contributions to policy. Civil rights organizations may be usefully able to use our evidence in legal challenges to the DMCA. And then, of course, platforms want to mitigate this chilling effect, because if people stop tweeting because they posted their favorite Disney character, that might be something of implications for them. And then the final part of that study, which I'm working with Jonathan Zong, is we're looking at ways to better communicate to the public what the effects are, and also find ways to debrief people who are part of very large-scale studies. So a lot of our work happens through consent. This study, because we can't anticipate who's going to get DMC takedown notices, we'll have to do the study without telling them they're part of a study. And so we're designing a large-scale automated debriefing system, and together with Jonathan Zong, who I believe is in the room, we'll be looking at these two questions of how we can better communicate to non-experts causal inference in studies like this, and how we can manage the debriefing process of large studies of this kind. So questions that I want to be asking, not just today, but of this community over time, like how can we build up the consumer protection research ecosystem for social technology and AI, where we know it's not just a case of understanding the algorithms, but it's understanding the complex interactions between these systems and human behavior. I'll be teaching a class in the spring on field experiments, and also hopefully over the next year, CivilServant will be supporting, I hope, up to 100 new randomized trials together with communities. The goal is to really scale this research. And so if you have ideas of studies you want to do with communities on Reddit, Twitter, Wikipedia, YouTube, please other platforms we expand to, please talk to me, because we can't achieve that scale with just me and a few other researchers. I want to make it so, basically I want to make it so easy for researchers to work directly with communities and produce public interest knowledge that is valuable to society, that it becomes easier and easier over time to poach talented people from the tech industry to grow this consumer protection world. So if help me get there. We're doing work on empirical research ethics. So yes, there are moral and ethical questions to ask, but often there are empirical questions about how people respond to and make sense of our ethics procedures. So stay like the work with Jonathan. And then also I'm trying to build a nonprofit around this. So advice, help, funding, all of those things are welcome. And I'm trying to figure out, like, what does a career doing this look like? Partly anchored in academia, partly doing this public interest research. If any room of people can help me figure that out, this is absolutely one of those rooms. And so I'm excited to continue the conversation here in this room and over the next 2 years as a postdoc here at CITP. Thanks. And I'll take a couple questions. We have till 1:30, is that right? So I'll take some questions, and then I might pose some questions to you all. But let's start with questions for me.
How are you able to get the Twitter copyright data? Or how did you measure the chilling effect?
Yeah, so the question is, how are we able to get the Twitter copyright data? So there's this amazing service that was set up about 15 years ago called the Lewin database. And this is one of the very few areas where we've gotten transparency from platforms. Basically, for Google, Twitter, YouTube in some cases, and other platforms, every time they receive a copyright takedown notice, they forward that notice onto a server at Harvard, which is a public record. And that server has an API. And so we are actually able to query that server in real time, find out who has received these DMCA takedown notices, find out in some cases what action Twitter took, and then enroll that person into our study. And so, I think looking for strategic opportunities for transparency around certain key issues is going to be a key infrastructural question for this kind of research. We've seen recently that Facebook has talked about releasing ads that were supported by non-American organizations during the presidential election. And it may be possible that as more of those kinds of research become released, that the burden on platforms becomes so great that they start thinking about more systematized endeavors. And that will open up avenues for novel studies, not just forensic studies, which I think is what Lewin was designed for, but actually some of these behavioral studies, if we get that real-time feed from platforms. Great question. Oh, and if people could repeat their name to me when they ask a question, that would be great. Thanks. Another question.
Ben, I'm curious. You're looking here at platforms where it's possible to, if someone posts fake news, it's possible to have a conversation about it, even if you don't fact check or vote. Is it also possible for your system to look at more targeted fake news systems, such as on Facebook?
So the question is, I think, let me see if I get this right, from Ben, is that we're able to look at misinformation or news from inaccurate sources in cases where someone posts it and then everyone discusses it. And it's
potentially
kind of more visible, right? Compared to a situation like Facebook where something propagates privately between people. And the question is, can we look at this in a Facebook situation as well?
I don't mean between people, but I mean more that the platform decides what you see as an individual user.
So the question is about machine learning personalization.
Right.
So here, everyone saw the same ranked list, which allowed us to look at the effect on that list that everyone saw. The question is, can we like on Facebook newsfeed and elsewhere, people see a personal version of the newsfeed. Is there something we could do there? I am hopeful. So some of you may have seen a study that Matt Salganik did with a class, where they asked lots of different people to try to influence their own newsfeed. It wasn't a randomized trial, but that is one approach. Another approach that I've used in a platform audit with Facebook was a case where Facebook released a LGBT pride emoji this past June. And they gave some people on the platform the ability to like click a reaction button and send a rainbow to their friends, but they didn't give it to everyone. And they said some things about the kind of differential release of this. I'll see if I can pull up the article where we looked at this. And what we did is we used Facebook's targeted advertising to survey people across the platform in different regions to see who had it. So here's the pride emoji.
I didn't get that.
And yeah, so you may not have gotten it. So Facebook said that like basically one of two conditions had to happen. Either you had to be in a market that like had a substantial pride showing, and then you also, or alternatively, if you liked a certain page, the official company LGBTQ page. And so what we did is we used, I'll blow this up, we used the targeted advertising to send ads to people asking them to tell us if they could see it. And we sent it to people in certain cities, and then we also differentiated, does Facebook consider them to have like a LGBT interest or not? So we were able to do a stratified sample for large cities and small cities across the United States. And then we were able to then do a statistical model to see if LGBT interested people, according to Facebook, had a higher chance of reporting that they had compared to people who Facebook thought didn't have an LGBT interest. We also did some other analyses looking at seeing if there might be some political dimension to it as well, which we didn't find an effect. But here's an example of it. We did this in 3 days. And so and it cost about $500 to get the ads out to people. Often, I think people don't turn to the citizen science approach because it seems so easy if only you have access to the levers behind the platform, right? If you're a software engineer, you think it's so hard to ask people to do this, when actually there's this massive kind of design space of possible studies that I think are possible. I'm currently prototyping a newsfeed randomized trial that I think might be able to use a similar recruitment method where we use Facebook's targeted ad system to recruit people with different characteristics according to what the algorithm considers their interests to be, and then test the differential outcomes of a certain kind of intervention in people's news feeds. So the hope with CivilServant is that these studies aren't just one-offs, but by building an experimentation infrastructure that incorporates ethics procedures that are accountable to the people in the studies, it could be, we can streamline that process and make it easier and easier and quicker to do those studies, because of course, new things come up, algorithms change, culture changes, human behavior changes, and simply having one study and then that becomes the study about this issue that was never replicated doesn't really allow us to move from talking about risks into actual consumer protection. And so those are some of the technical and research questions that we get to muddle through as the nonprofit. Other questions? Why don't I ask a question? I know some people here at CITP are thinking about what it means to have different kinds of accountability and consumer protection around these systems and these behaviors. I'm curious how you think about how you think about the maybe questions of both responsibility, because you have these interactions between large-scale social behavior and technologies, and how, where you see kind of openings for this kind of consumer protection research, either as methodologists or as policy people. Like, are there particular issues that seem like the really important ones that we can make progress on because the public cares about them, or because there's a methodological opportunity that we can be, tackling?
Well, for instance, I really love Amazon, but I have no idea how many levers they're pushing to make me buy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much to explore there. For instance, how they structure their shipping incentive patterns to stimulate buying items.
So the question is about Amazon and this question of how they might be nudging people in different ways. I know that Christo Wilson over at Northeastern in the Auditing Algorithms Lab has done some work with browser plugins, so that if you, again, this citizen science approach, where if you can somehow manage to get enough people to use this browser plugin, which can sometimes be tricky, then they can monitor differences in their what they see, and then start to get a picture of what the algorithm is doing. I actually think that there's a real opportunity for lab experiments, weirdly, for testing some of these things. So if people, going back to that first slide of Pelican Cialdini, oh, that is not my deck, that's fine, where like lab experiments and field experiments and ethnography fit together. Imagine, for example, I'll pick a current example. Imagine, for example, that people are really worried about, politically, like some of these kind of political ads during the US election. Like, we can document that the ads reached certain people at certain times, and we might get to that point. But that still doesn't answer the question of, did they have an impact? And that's where we can't necessarily turn back the clock. We might get really lucky with a natural experiment and be like, oh, this source of exogeneity made it possible for us to discover. But that's pretty rare. We can't count on that. And so what political scientists often do is they then take the ads and put people into lab experiments, and they look at those effects under controlled conditions. Solomon Messing did a great job at this in his work on the effect of darkening Obama's skin tone in video ads on like voter attitudes, where actually by taking things into the lab, you can like fill that like last mile of causal inference, and even looking back on something that you think a company might be doing, determine how risky it is or what its impacts might be. So it really does take that combination of multiple methods to use the tools available to ask the question. That's a great question, though. It would be really fun to document what people think the behavioral nudges are, and then try to test them in various ways.
Yeah. I guess one question I have is about the ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So with citizen science, it seems slightly different than citizen behavioral science. If you're giving people the ability to conduct these massive online experiments,
mm-hmm.
How do you prevent ethical violations and from people conducting experiments that are not so altruistic in nature?
Yeah, so the question is, if we are providing people the capacity to do these large experiments, how do we manage the ethics and the risks of that experimentation itself?
Yeah, because I mean, as people who conduct research, often like if you're at a university or even if you're in a company, you have to go through some sort of ethics training, you have to have consenting procedures, etc. I understand that you can't always do consenting procedures here, but at least you have some sort of oversight. Whereas here, if anyone can conduct something, who's to say they're not going to be conducting experiments that are not
Yeah, so there are a few ways right now the civil servant manages those risks. Firstly, we approve all studies.
Okay.
And we are also governed by an IRB, which is obviously, not anyone who treats IRB as like their moral compass needs a better moral compass, because it's there to manage certain kinds of risk. We're also working with communities to develop processes of community ethics review. So I'm working with the science discussion community on Reddit to develop a process around data privacy and sharing around the studies we do. In as many cases as possible, we host a public community discussion about the experiment before it happens. And that actually has massive benefits to the validity of our research as well, because they think of all sorts of things that we need to account for in the study. And every study has a community debriefing as well, where we make known to the community the fact that we did the study, we answer all of their questions as far as we can. And through that, we kind of, through our transparency, we kind of draw the citizen behavioral scientists into a level of transparency and accountability that we will only work with them if they adopt. But there's a lot of work to do there, because figuring out the typical ethics procedures we have are all about compliance with U.S. law, and there are all sorts of just ways to be a jerk to other people that might be totally illegal, and that's where doing this work in a way that is accountable to the communities involved is a fundamental approach.
And also some of it you mentioned might be international, in which case it's unclear, if you're familiar with the laws of the country. I mean, it's unclear whose jurisdiction it is. And,
yes.
So it's a bit complicated.
Happy to talk about that further.
Yeah.
There is a substantial part of my dissertation on ethics. Jonathan and I are having a really fascinating and rich conversation about ethics as we try to, I think one of the things is that we often forget that we can design ethics procedures and we can test them. And that's an area where there might appear to be like loggerheads or unresolvable moral or ethical issues. That may have empirical assumptions that are not true. And there may be some design idea or some just fact about how people understand the world and understand ethics, that if we understand those things better, we may be able to resolve issues that we have formerly thought irresolvable and develop new ways of being ethical in research. And that's our hope in this component of the work. Well, it is 1:30. We should probably end the video at this time, but I will still be here. So if you have more questions, let's keep talking. I'll also be here for the next 2 years. So we're going to keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.